Mr. President, it is clear that President Trump's nominee to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, does not have enough support in the Senate to be confirmed under our rules. When a Supreme Court nominee does not have enough support to be confirmed, the solution is to pick a new nominee. But Republicans in the Senate are threatening to pursue a different path. They are considering breaking the Senate rules to force the nominee onto the Supreme Court anyway. Now, I'll be honest. I think it is crazy that we are considering confirming a lifetime Trump nominee to the Supreme Court at a moment when the president's campaign is under the cloud of an active, ongoing FBI counterintelligence investigation that could result in indictments and appeals that will go all the way to the Supreme Court, so that Trump's nominee could be the deciding vote on whether Trump or his supporters broke the law and will be held accountable. That is nuts, and I believe we should tap the brakes on any nominee until this investigation is concluded. But even if none of that were happening, I would still oppose the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch. My objection is based on Judge Gorsuch's record, which I have reviewed in detail. Judge Gorsuch's nomination is the latest step in a long political campaign by right-wing groups and their billionaire backers to capture our courts. Over the last 30 years, as the rich have gotten richer and working families have struggled to make ends meet, the scales of justice have been weighted further and further in favor of the wealthy and the powerful. Those powerful interests have invested vast sums of money into reshaping the judiciary, and their investment has paid off in spades. Recent Supreme Court decisions have made it easier for corporate giants who cheat their customers to avoid responsibility. Recent Supreme Court decisions have let those same corporations and their billionaire investors spend unlimited amounts of money to influence elections and manipulate the political process. And recent Supreme Court decisions have made it easier for businesses to abuse and discriminate against their workers. Giant corporations and right-wing groups have notched a lot of big wins in the Supreme Court lately, but they know that their luck depends on two things. First, stacking the courts with their allies, and second, stopping the confirmation of judges that don't sufficiently cater to their interests. That's part of the reason that they launched an all-out attack on fair-minded, mainstream judges. Judges like Merrick Garland, a thoughtful, intelligent, fair judge, to fill the open vacancy on the Supreme Court. These very same corporate and right-wing groups handed Donald Trump a list of acceptable people to fill the Supreme Court vacancy. And as a presidential candidate, he promised to pick a justice from their list. And who made it onto that right-wing list? People who, unlike Judge Garland, displayed a sufficient allegiance to their corporate and right-wing interests. Judge Gorsuch was on that list, and his nomination is their reward. Even before he became a federal judge, Judge Gorsuch fully embraced right-wing, pro-corporate views. He argued that it should be harder, not easier, for shareholders who got cheated to bring fraud cases in court. And on the bench, Judge Gorsuch's extreme views meant giant corporations could run over their workers. In Hobby Lobby, when he had to choose between the rights of corporations and the rights of women, Judge Gorsuch chose corporations. In consumer protection cases, when he had to choose between the rights of corporations and the rights of the consumers they cheated, Judge Gorsuch chose corporations. In discrimination cases, when he had to choose between the rights of corporations and the rights of employees who had been discriminated against, Judge Gorsuch chose corporations. Time after time, in case after case, Judge Gorsuch showed a remarkable talent for creatively interpreting the law in ways that benefited large corporations and that harmed working Americans women, children, and consumers. And when it comes to the rules that prevent giant corporations from polluting our air and our water, from poisoning our food, from cheating hardworking families, Judge Gorsuch believes that it should be easier, not harder, easier, for judges to overturn those rules, a view that is even more extreme than that of the late Justice Scalia. Republicans assert that Judge Gorsuch is a fair, mainstream judge, but right-wing groups and their wealthy anonymous funders picked him for one reason, because they know that he will be their ally. And that's not how our court system is supposed to work. Judges should be neutral arbiters dispensing equal justice under law. They should not be people handpicked by wealthy insiders and giant corporations. For the working families struggling to make ends meet, for people desperately in need of health care, for everyone fighting for their right to vote, for disabled students fighting for access to a quality education, for anyone who cares about our justice system, there is only one question that should guide us in evaluating a nominee to sit on any court: whether that person will defend equal justice for every single one of us. Judge Gorsuch's record answers that question with a loud no. Republicans have a choice. They can tell President Trump to send a new nominee, a Main Street nominee who can earn broad support, or they can jam through this nominee. If they do jam through Judge Gorsuch, the Republicans will own the Gorsuch court and every extreme 5-4 decision that comes out of it. Republicans will own every attack on a woman's right to choose, on voting rights, on LGBTQ rights, on secret spending in our political system, and on freedom of speech and religion. Republicans will be responsible for every 5-4 decision that throws millions of Americans under the bus in order to favor the powerful, moneyed few who helped put Judge Gorsuch on the bench. Right now, the presidency is in the hands of someone who has shown contempt for our Constitution, contempt for our independent judiciary, contempt for our free press, and contempt for our moral democratic principles. If ever we needed a strong, independent Supreme Court with broad public support, a Supreme Court that will stand up to for the Constitution, it is now. If ever there were a time to say that our courts should not be handed over to the highest bidder, it is now. And that is why Judge Gorsuch should not be confirmed to sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to support the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch to serve as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. By any objective measure, Judge Gorsuch is impeccably qualified. He is a graduate of Columbia University and the Harvard Law School, and was awarded a doctorate from Oxford. He is a former law clerk to the legendary Justice Byron White, as well as for Justice Kennedy. And he has been a respected federal appellate judge for a decade. Judge Gorsuch has spent a lifetime in the law, and his record indicates that he will make an exemplary justice. Just 2 weeks ago, Judge Gorsuch testified for 20 hours before the Senate Judiciary Committee. His conduct during the hearing only further confirmed what his record demonstrates, that Neil Gorsuch is a principled jurist and a good man. And I was glad for all of us to get that confirmation, because Judge Gorsuch bears a heavy responsibility. He is being asked to fill the seat of Justice Antonin Scalia. In truth, I doubt that anyone could truly fill Justice Scalia's shoes. Justice Scalia was one of a kind, and his enormous impact on the law and on the court impact this nation for generations to come. All of us miss him dearly. But I take solace in the knowledge that one of the ways in which I believe it will be easiest for Judge Gorsuch to imitate Scalia, perhaps the most important way, is judicial humility. Justice Scalia's greatest strength was not his amazing wit, his mighty pen, or his larger-than-life personality, as much as we loved those parts of him. Rather, it was his consistent unwillingness to accumulate power to himself and to the courts. He refused to impose his own personal policy preferences on the law, but instead understood that his role as a judge was simply to apply the law that the elected representatives of the people had enacted. This type of judging doesn't take otherworldly talent, though Scalia had that in abundance. Instead, it takes character, integrity, humility. Judge Gorsuch's lengthy record and his hearing testimony demonstrate that he has those attributes as well. He understands that his role as a judge is to apply the words of the Constitution and the laws of the United States to the specific cases that come before him, and nothing more. This is critical in an era when the Supreme Court has come to be seen by many, for good reason, as an activist court, as a super legislature that seeks to impose its own will in the place of the written law. It is this very humility that angers so many on the left. They don't want someone who humbly applies the law. Rather, they demand nothing less than a person fully committed to enacting from the Supreme Court bench whatever policies the left is championing at that given moment, because they know that their only refuge is the courts, because the American people would reject the policies at the voting booth. Judge Gorsuch is clearly not that kind of person. So they have committed to opposing his confirmation by whatever means necessary, legitimate or not. Indeed, if this were being decided on qualifications and record, Judge Gorsuch would be confirmed unanimously. And we don't have to hypothesize about that, because Judge Gorsuch has already been confirmed by this body a decade ago by voice vote without recorded dissent. Not a single senator objected. Not Ted Kennedy, not Hillary Clinton, not Barack Obama, not Joe Biden, and not even Democratic members who still serve in this chamber, like Chuck Schumer, Dianne Feinstein, Pat Leahy, or Dick Durbin. Not a one of them spoke out against Gorsuch's nomination to the Court of Appeals. Not one. So what changed? The only thing that changed is that the radical left has become angry, extremely angry. And my Democratic colleagues are worried that they will get opposed from their left in a primary. That's it. Their base demands total war, total obstruction. Unfortunately for them, it has proven difficult to invent attacks against an obviously well-qualified judge like Judge Gorsuch. My Democratic colleagues couldn't get any legitimate grievance to stick at the hearings last week, despite their best efforts. But it hasn't stopped them from repeating their outlandish attacks over and over again. If the stakes weren't so high, it might even be humorous. But it isn't really funny, because the primary argument that the Democrats have made is dangerous. Their attack on Neil Gorsuch is a direct attack on the rule of law itself. Contrary to the foundations of our government and legal system, my colleagues from across the aisle are arguing that Judge Gorsuch is unqualified to be a justice because he allegedly failed to side with the, quote, little guy over the big guy. In their view, it is now the job of judges to reject equal protection, to take the blindfold off of Lady Justice, and instead, judges should put their thumbs on the scale to actively discriminate against parties based on their identity. This notion of partisan, results-oriented judging is directly contrary to the constitutional system we have in this country. My Democratic colleagues are openly calling for judges to enforce their own political preferences from the bench, and they want to use a person's willingness or unwillingness to do so as a litmus test for who gets on the court. This isn't even a jurisprudential position. It's a political position. And it's difficult to imagine a more effective way to destroy our judicial system, the best in the world, despite its flaws, than to adopt this results-oriented approach. Make no mistakes, the Democrats' trumpeting of outcome-based judging will have consequences. Judges and potential judges nationwide will now have heard their siren call. You want smooth sailing and a confirmation hearing from the Democrats? Ignore the law, ignore the facts, and pick sides based upon who you sympathize with, whoever is politically correct at that moment in time. My Democratic colleagues claim to detest attacks on the independent judiciary. There aren't many attacks more dangerous and chilling of true independence and impartiality than the one they're making now. The public, the people that appear in court seeking an honest tribunal, have also heard this open call for bias, for prejudice, for discrimination. And I doubt they'll soon forget it. Luckily, Judge Gorsuch stood firm at his confirmation hearing. He reaffirmed what was clear from his record, that he will not legislate his own policy preferences from the bench, and that he will respect the limited role a judge plays in our constitutional structure. He did all of this in the face of unrelenting opposition from my Democratic colleagues, who demanded that he violate his judicial oath and swear to decide certain cases and political questions in a way that they would prefer. No recent nominee to the Supreme Court has ever made such pledges, and Judge Gorsuch rightfully refused to do so last week. Their demands of Judge Gorsuch were particularly galling, given that this was the most transparent process in history for selecting a Supreme Court justice. During the campaign, Donald Trump promised the American people that if elected, he would choose a justice in the mold of Justice Scalia. He laid out a specific list of 21 potential nominees, including Judge Gorsuch. The voters were able to see precisely who President Trump would nominate, and they were able to decide for themselves if that was the future they wanted for the Supreme Court. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, promised a very different kind of justice. She promised a liberal judicial activist who would vote to undermine free speech, to undermine religious liberty, to undermine the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. In a very real sense, this election was a referendum on the Supreme Court. The American people could decide for themselves between a faithful originalist vision of the Constitution and a progressive liberal activist vision. And the voters chose. Donald Trump is now President Trump. And he has kept his promise to the American people, selecting Judge Neil Gorsuch from that list of 21 judges. Judge Gorsuch is no ordinary nominee. Because of this unique and transparent process, unprecedented in our nation's history, his nomination carries with it a kind of super legitimacy in that it has been ratified by the American people at the voting booth. Neil Gorsuch is not simply the president's nominee. It is a direction chosen by the American people, and I urge my colleagues to confirm him. I yield the floor.